Today we're on chapter 7 of Owls in the Family by Farley Mowat. When the owls first came to live with us, Mutt didn't think much of them. He was jealous of all my pets, but he was particularly jealous of the owls because they took up so much of my time. He never did get on very well with Wool, but after a few weeks he got so he could tolerate Weeps. I think this was because Weeps was so helpless and because Mutt had to defend him from other dogs and from the neighborhood cats. And of course, Weeps got very fond of Mutt, knowing he could depend on the old boy to protect him. Whenever Weeps was let out of his cage, he would start searching around for Mutt. Once he spotted him, Weeps would give a little whoop of relief and go scuttling over to his protector's side. If Mutt was lying down, Weeps would snuggle in between his paws. Sometimes he would get so close that his horn feathers would tickle Mutt's nose, and then Mutt would sneeze and almost blow poor Weeps over backwards. If Weeps got to be too much of a nuisance, Mutt would try to hide from him under the garage, but it wasn't much use. Weeps would squeeze under the garage too. He hated to let Mutt get out of his sight for even a minute. Mutt's relations with Wool were another story. Wool wasn't afraid of anything that walked, flew, or crawled, and that included Mutt. As far as Wool was concerned, old Mutt was something to be teased and pestered, and Wool used to tease the life half out of him. Mutt was an absent-minded sort of dog. Instead of burying a bone he didn't happen to be using at the moment, he would often forget about it and leave it lying on the grass. That was a mistake, because pretty soon Wool would find it and swoop down and carry it off. It wasn't that Wool liked bones himself. Not having any teeth, he couldn't chew them. He just liked to take them away from Mutt. Once he had the bone, he would put it somewhere where Mutt could see it or smell it, but couldn't reach it. Sometimes he would put the bone in the crotch of a tree, just high enough that Mutt couldn't jump up and get it. Or sometimes he would hide it in gutters of the porch roof, so that nice, rich bone smell would drift down and torment Mutt till he was nearly crazy. Another of Wool's tricks was stealing Mutt's dinner. Mutt used to be fed on the back porch about 5 o'clock each afternoon. When Wool was feeling particularly bored or ornery, he would play the dinner stealing game. Having waited until Mutt started eating, Wool would scoot around to the front of the house and set up such a ruckus that it sounded like 2 dog fights and a cat fight all happening at the same time. Mutt always fell for it. As soon as he heard the row, he would come tearing around the corner, woof, woof, woofing, ready for trouble. But while he was peering around in his short-sighted way to see where the trouble was, Wool would have flown over the top of the house and be gobbling down Mutt's dinner on the back porch. When Mutt got back and found the plate empty, he would look very puzzled. Being absent-minded, he couldn't always remember whether he had finished his dinner or not. All he knew was that he still felt hungry. But Wool's favorite game with Mutt was the tail squeeze. Mutt was already a fairly old dog when the owls came to live with us, and during the heat of the summer afternoons he liked to have a snooze under the poplar trees in our front yard. He had hollowed out a bed for himself in the moist earth beneath the trees, where he could lie in comfort until the sun started to go down and the air began to get a little cooler. Wool, on the other hand, never seemed to sleep at all, although according to bird books, horned owls are supposed to sleep all day and hunt all night. Perhaps Wool had never read those books. Perhaps because Wool had never read those books, he was just as active in the daytime as at night, maybe more so. On summer days, when I was away somewhere and there were no kids to play with, Wool would get bored. That was usually when he would play the tail squeeze game. At first, making sure Mutt was really fast asleep, Wool would begin to stalk the old dog the way a cat would stalk a bird. He always did it on foot, I think because he felt it wouldn't be playing fair to use his wings. Starting from the front porch, Wool would sneak across the yard, moving so slowly and carefully he hardly seemed to be moving at all. If Mutt happened to raise his head, he would see Wool standing stock still on the grass and staring innocently up at the sky, as if he were wondering whether or not it was going to rain. After a long, suspicious look at Wool, Mutt's eyelids would begin to droop, his head would sag, and soon he'd be fast asleep again. He snored, too, and as soon as the snores started, Wool would continue his slow and careful approach. Sometimes it took Wool an hour or more to cross the lawn, but he did it so quietly and cautiously, Mutt never had a chance. When he had sneaked up close enough, Wool would raise one big foot and very, very gently lower it over the end of Mutt's long and bushy tail. Then Wool would let out a piercing scream, and at the same moment he would give the tail a good hard squeeze. Poor Mutt would leap straight in the air, yelping with surprise and pain. By the time he got his bearings and was ready to take a bite out of Wool, the owl would have flown to the limb of a nearby tree from which he would peer down at Mutt with as much as to say, "Good heavens, what terrible nightmare you must have been having." Mutt would roar and froth around the tree, daring Wool to come down and fight like a dog. Then Wool would make things even worse by closing his eyes and pretending to go sound asleep. Although Wool loved practical jokes, the funny thing was he never really harmed other animals if he could help it. Of course, if something tried to hurt him, that was different. Then Wool could be dangerous. But he certainly wasn't fierce and bloodthirsty kind of bird that owls are supposed to be. Wouldn't even go hunting on his own. If a gopher or a white rabbit happened to get loose on the lawn, he wouldn't touch it. However, there was one kind of animal he would attack, and that was a skunk. It just seems that all horned animals just naturally hate skunks, though no one knows the reason why. What's more, horned owls are the only things I know that will eat a skunk, and they even seem to like the taste. Our house in Saskatoon stood close to a river, and along the bank of the river was a regular jungle of bushes and poplar trees, which made an ideal place for skunks to live. Because they didn't have any enemies in town, the riverbank skunks had become so cocky they would stroll along the sidewalk in front of our place as boldly as if they owned it. Can't seem to get that in. There we go. That looks clear. That was before Wool came to live with us. Cocky as ever, one of the riverbank skunks decided to take a walk down Crescent Avenue one summer evening just after Wool had learned how to fly. The skunk came strutting down the sidewalk, quite sure nothing in the world would dare to bother him. He ambled along, taking his own time until he got under the overhanging branches of our poplar trees. Mother and Dad and I were having dinner. The dining room windows were open because it had been such a hot day. All of a sudden, there was a great swoosh of wings, and there on the windowsill sat Wool. Before any of us had time to move, he gave a leap and landed on the floor beside my chair. And he hadn't come empty-handed. Clutched in his talons was an enormous skunk. The skunk was dead, but that didn't help matters much because before he died, he had managed to soak himself in wool with his own special brand of perfume. "Hoo, hoo, hoo," Wool said proudly, which probably meant, "May I join you? I've brought my supper with me." Nobody stopped to answer. We three people were already stampeding through the door of the dining room, coughing and choking. Wool had to eat his dinner all by himself. It was 2 weeks before we could use the dining room again, and when Mother sent the rug and drapes to the cleaners, the man who owned the shop phoned her right back and wanted to know if she was trying to ruin him. Wool didn't smell so sweet either, but he couldn't understand why he was so unpopular all of a sudden. His feelings must have been hurt by the way everybody kept trying to avoid him. After 2 or 3 days, when even I wouldn't go near him or let him come near me, he became very unhappy. Then an idea must have come into his funny head. He must have decided we were mad at him because he hadn't shared his skunk with us. So one day he went down to the river bank and caught a second skunk and brought it home for us. By this time, he was so soaked in skunk oil that you could smell him a block away. Some of our neighbors complained about it, and so finally my father had to give Wool a bath in about a gallon of tomato juice. Tomato juice is the only thing that'll wash away the smell of skunk. Poor Wool, by the time Dad was through with him, he looked like a rag mop that had been dipped in ketchup. But he got the idea, and he never brought skunks home to us again.